Mike McDermott, and in this video I'm going to look at two more of the Indian campaigns. The first, the campaign against the Modoc Indians in the Pacific Northwest, and secondly, the Apaches in the Southwest. Two very different kinds of situations, different terrain, different kinds of Indians. But first, the Modoc campaign, which was remarkable in and of itself for several reasons. It was noteworthy for the number of Army casualties in proportion to the number of Indians who were involved. It was noteworthy for the tenacity of a relatively small number of Modoc warriors who held out against a seemingly overwhelming force that was brought against them. And it was also noteworthy for the extraordinarily difficult nature of the country in which the Modoc chose to fight. They had earlier ceded their traditional homeland on Lost River in Northern California, and they had moved to the Klamath Reservation in Southern Oregon when it was established in 1864, that is during the latter part of the American Civil War. The Modocs were a tough, proud, and warlike people, and tensions with their Klamath kinsmen over land and hunting rights on the reservation soon became serious and caused the Modocs to return to Lost River in Northern California. But in their absence, settlers had begun to move onto that land, and eventually Alfred Macomb, the superintendent of Indian Affairs, persuaded them to return to Oregon. Then conflict within the Modoc community developed between Sconchin, the tribe's chief who wanted to solve problems on the reservation, and Kintposh, a breakaway rival, also known as Captain Jack. In March 1870, Captain Jack, supported by the mystical fanaticism of medicine man Curly-Headed Doctor, left the Klamath Reservation and led a band of about 200 people back to Lost River in California. Another group, led by Hooker Jim, also left the reservation for Lost River. Settlers in that region soon became vocal about Indians roaming the countryside, demanding land rent from settlers, and raiding homesteads for food. Both Macomb and his successor, Thomas Odenley, strongly recommended that the Modocs be forcefully returned to their reservation in Oregon, and the Indian Bureau agreed. General Edward Canby, commanding the Department of the Columbia, was ordered to cooperate with the Indian Bureau while stipulating that if troops were to be used, the force employed should be so large as to secure the result at once. Superintendent Odenell requested Army support, and Captain James Jackson arrived from Fort Klamath with 3 officers and 40 troopers assigned to the 1st Cavalry. At dawn on the 29th of November, the troops deployed at the edge of Captain Jack's camp, which contained about 17 families, and demanded their weapons. What they got was a firefight, resulting in 1 soldier killed and 7 wounded, while 1 Indian was killed and another was wounded before the band fled in boats. At the same time, across the river, a local posse tried to seize the 14 warriors and their families camped with Hooker Jim. The posse retreated when the Indians killed 3 of the group, and then 18 other settlers lost their lives before the band joined up with Captain Jack. Now on the run, the 75 warriors and about 150 women and children took refuge in the extensive lava beds on the south side of Tule Lake, an area of incredibly rough ridges, depressions, and caves. In an area admirably suited for defense, the Indians met the first attack with heavy and accurate rifle fire. Initially, 2 mountain howitzers joined the dawn assault, which began in a thick fog. The artillery was ineffective, and when the fog burned off, the troops were pinned down until after dark, when they were finally able to withdraw. 9 soldiers had been killed and 19 more were wounded, while no Indians were injured in that first assault on what became known as Captain Jack's stronghold. Given the nature of the terrain, very few Modocs were even seen during the engagement. About 100 California and Oregon militia arrived to join the fight, and the day's outcome caused them to reconsider and then to leave for home. The 225 soldiers facing the lava bed settled into a cold and wet winter, while a peace commission comprised of General Canby, former Commissioner Meacham, and Commissioners L.S.R. Thomas and L.S. Dyer attempted to negotiate a settlement with the Indians. Meeting at a peace tent, which had been set up between the lava beds and the Army's positions, the Modocs insisted on their own reservation on Lost River in California and amnesty for everyone involved. General Canby demanded the return of the band to the Klamath Reservation in Oregon and the surrender of the men who had committed murder. The talks were at a standstill and civilians got involved when Captain Jack asked to meet with local individuals he had previously known, but again, nothing came of those efforts. The Peace Commission, along with Frank Riddle and his Modoc wife, Toby, serving as interpreters, met at the peace tent with Captain Jack and a delegation of Indians who again demanded their own reservation. The discussion became heated, and when two warriors carrying rifles appeared from hiding, Captain Jack pulled a pistol and shot General Canby in the face, killing him on the spot. Stripping the general of his uniform, Captain Jack pulled it on while other Indians killed Commissioner Thomas. Alfred Meacham was wounded but escaped with the others as the Indians ran back into the lava beds. The Army again assaulted the stronghold and over a 3-day period slowly worked through the lava, only to find that the Modocs had departed, retreating into other lava beds further south while leaving the bodies of 3 men and 8 women behind who had been killed during the shooting. A patrol of 64 soldiers was surprised, and 16 of those men were wounded, while all 5 officers with the patrol and 20 other soldiers were killed. Warriors then attacked an Army encampment at Dry Lake and lost 5 warriors, while the Army had 5 soldiers killed and 12 more wounded. The Indians then split into several bands, and Hooker Jim and 13 warriors with their families surrendered south of Lower Klamath Lake in California. Captain Jack's camp was surprised, causing the Indians to scatter, and over the next several days, individuals and family groups surrendered to cavalry who were scouting the area. Finally, on the 3rd of June, 1872, Captain Jack and his family were discovered in a cave, and they surrendered, bringing the Modoc campaign to an end. 6 of the Indians were charged and convicted of murder. President Grant commuted the sentences of 2 of them to life imprisonment, and they were taken to Alcatraz, while the other 4, to include Captain Jack, were hanged at Fort Klamath on the 3rd of October, 1873. Unrepentant to the last, he was heard to say, quote, "I am ready to go to the Great Father," end quote. And he said that as the trap was sprung. 155 Modocs were transported to Oklahoma Territory and settled on a piece of land, while the members of the tribe who had stayed on the Klamath Reservation in Oregon remained there. The Lava Beds War pursued, although there was little threat to American interests or to white settlement, cost the United States over $500,000 at the time. A total of 47 soldiers and 21 civilians were killed, while fewer than 24 Indians died in the fighting. Only later did cooler heads recognize that establishing a Modoc reservation would have been less expensive and more humane for everyone concerned. The campaign also marked the only occasion during the Indian Wars when an active duty United States Army general was killed. And now, To the Apache campaign. The United States Army conducted a series of campaigns, in fact, against the Apache Indians beginning in 1854 and continuing until Geronimo eventually surrendered in 1886. The Apaches occasionally combined their forces, but more often they raided in small war parties that roamed the Southwest and northern Mexico, attacking other tribes, Mexicans and Americans, for livestock, food, and captives. Those who fought Apache raiders seldom saw their attackers because warriors were masters of concealment and ambush, seemingly able to vanish into the landscape and often moving faster on foot than their pursuers could travel horseback. Successful Stone Age hunter-gatherers living in some of the most barren and inhospitable land on the continent, the Apache way of war was carried out by men who valued the surprise attack from cover more than an open confrontation. Apache warriors did not wear feathered headdresses or take scalps. They did not engage in victory dances, or they did not count coup, but they were ruthless and efficient killers who routinely tortured their enemies to death and earned a fearful and well-deserved reputation. Their first conflict with Americans occurred at the end of the Mexican War, when Apaches killed a group of settlers in 1849. Apaches then began attacking mail carriers and other travelers on the following year. The Army became involved when about 250 Apaches and their Ute allies ambushed 60 Army dragoons near present-day Pilar, New Mexico. That battle lasted 4 hours and was a significant victory for the Indians, who killed 22 soldiers and wounded 36 more before the survivors were able to disengage. Guided by Kit Carson, additional dragoons tracked that band and successfully attacked them in Ojo Caliente Canyon. Incessant, bloody raids and rounds of retaliation marked the next 2 decades as Apaches vowed to drive both the Americans and the Mexicans out of their territory, while pressure from growing settlement increased that conflict. Indian leaders Mangus Coloradus and his son-in-law Cochise, as well as Natchez, Victorio, Nana, and Geronimo, came to prominence as the Army struggled to pacify them. The mission was complicated by too few troops for both garrison duty and the endless patrols that seemed the only way to catch the elusive raiders. Low morale and desertions were common in both volunteer and Army units. While treaties were negotiated, reservations were established in an effort to control the various Apache bands. On the 4th of June, 1871, General George Crook took command of the Department of Arizona and recommended a vigorous campaign against raiders who left the reservation. He was stalled, however, by Peace Commissioner Vincent Collier, who wanted to continue negotiating with the Indians. During the next year, the Apaches respond to the commissioner's blandishments with an outbreak of 54 officially verified raids that took the lives of 44 people, and General Crook announced it was time to punish the incorrigible hostile. Hiring Apache scouts who were willing to track their kinsmen and using pack mules rather than supply wagons to move fast, the general trained the troops hard and ensured they carried only essentials. General Crook also believed in the advantages of winter campaigning and launched his operation in November of 1872 with several columns fanning out in search of those Apaches he intended to punish. His tactics focused on finding a trail and staying on it until the Indians were forced to fight. In addition to a series of skirmishes that surprised war parties and killed about 200 Indians, the troops caught and defeated large bands in the Salt River Canyon and at Turret Butte. The Apaches, convinced of General Crook's tenacity and worn down by his incessant pursuit, began returning to their reservations, although they showed very little interest in becoming model citizens. While 6,000 Apaches were drawing rations on their American reservations, other bands continued to live in Mexico, and war parties from the reservations raided both sides of the Rio Grande, routinely crossing the international border that inhibited their pursuers. In 1873, several of the bands were moved to the San Carlos Reservation on the Upper Gila River in Arizona, while 700 other Apaches, to include Geronimo, crossed into Mexico and disappeared into the Sierra Madre Mountains. Skirmishing against Mexican troops and raiding on both sides of the border, Geronimo and his band were surprised and captured while visiting and resting and recruiting on the Ojo Caliente Reservation in April of 1877. The Army escorted them to San Carlos, but the following month Geronimo and others were back in Mexico, stealing horses and killing ranchers and travelers. Finally receiving permission to cross the border, General Crook dispatched columns of troopers into Mexico in an effort to catch the recalcitrants, who then raided north into the United States, killing and plundering as they rode across New Mexico and Arizona, before again slipping south of the border, staying one jump ahead of their American Army pursuers. American troops continued to operate in Mexico, although the units most successful in killing Apache raiders were Apache scouts, led by American officers. Captain Emmett Crawford and his scouts located and attacked Geronimo's camp on the 9th of January in 1886, but then Captain Crawford was mistakenly killed by Mexican troops who thought that his scouts were the enemy. General Crook, commanding the Department of Arizona, described the Apache warrior as, quote, an embodiment of physical endurance, sinews like steel, insensible to hunger, fatigue, or physical pain, end quote. Geronimo finally agreed to meet with General Crook, but then he had second thoughts, and he and about 40 of his followers disappeared again. General Nelson Miles then took command and ordered Captain Henry Lawton and his Apache scouts to go after Geronimo and return him to the United States either dead or alive. Pressed until the survivors of his band were exhausted, Geronimo surrendered on the 4th of September 1886 at Skeleton Canyon, Arizona, officially ending the Apache campaign. Geronimo was initially exiled to Florida, but then he was exhibited at various fairs and included in President Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade in Washington, D.C. Geronimo died on the 17th of February, 1909, and is buried at the Fort Sill Indian Agency Cemetery. His deathbed words were, quote, I should have never surrendered. I should have fought until I was the last man alive, end quote. In fact, that distinction was reserved for about 30 Apache warriors who had a shootout with the 10th Cavalry on the 9th of January, 1918. That's during the First World War. The Indians had been working in citrus groves near Tucson, Arizona, and they used their wages to buy weapons for raids into Mexico. Eventually, they were intercepted, and after a running fight, 10 of the group were captured, while all the others escaped. Excerpts from a soldier's letter written in 1887 provide an insight into the men serving in the Frontier Army at that time. And this is a quotation from a letter. I will now write a few lines to let you know that I'm alive and doing well. I joined the Army in January '86 and had a good fight with Geronimo and his Indians. I also had 2 hard fights where I come very near getting killed, but I got through all right. Charlie White came out with me and got in the same troop with me, and I sent him with 20 more men out on a scout after Indians, and Charlie was shot down by Indians on the very first day. My name isn't Charles Winters no more, since I shot that man in Jefferson Barracks. My captain at the time told me to take the name of his son who had died, and so my name since then is Charles H. Wood. My address is Troop D, 6th Cavalry, Fort Stanton, New Mexico, end quote. And so the captain, telling the soldier who was on the run for murder to take and use the name of his deceased son, gives an indication of the way in which the Army worked at that time and the way in which both officers and enlisted soldiers viewed their service. And so ends the Apache campaigns. Any comments that you may have, please make. And in the meantime, God bless America.